Hold on a second, Richard.
Okay.
I'll get it.
Just by way of introduction, I want to let you know where this presentation is coming from. I've been working with CAL FIRE FRAP on the 2015 FRAP assessment, and one of my jobs on that is to write the chapter on forests. And part of that story is carbon story in California forests. So there's an FIA report that's going to be published soon, and there's a whole series of tables, and then there's the database. And by the grace of God, I was blessed with Tim Robards, who went into the FIA database and extracted all of this information on carbon. And so the data that's actually he was looking at goes from 2001 to 2013. The report that's about to be published really is one complete sampling cycle from 2001 to 2010. So we've got a little bit additional data, and I had the FIA guys review this presentation, and they wanted me to make sure to let you know that there's some differences in the numbers that I'm presenting versus the numbers that will be in the report, and that's because of the inclusion of the additional 3 years of data. Okay, so what's FIA? I'm going to talk about that. Carbon storage versus sequestration, carbon storage by ownership, harvest versus growth, carbon storage by forest type, carbon storage and site productivity, and then opportunities for enhancing carbon storage. So for those of you that don't know what the FIA program is, it was created in 1928, and it's a national in scope, and it's to provide assessments of the nation's forested lands. In California, there's nearly 6,000 permanent plots on public and private forest land, and the most recent results that are going to be published represent a sampling of all of those plots between 2001 and 2010. As I said, we had 3 additional years of data, so that means about 1,800 more plots included in what I'm going to present. Here's just a picture of where those plots are. You know, for the folks who have been trying to use coal, coal is based on those plots, and so you know a little bit about that. Mark is raising the point that none of these plots are new. The 2010 to 2013 plots are remeasured plots. These are all permanent plots. Okay, I want to, I've been talking to my silviculture guru, who is John Helms. He wanted me to be sure to talk about the difference between sequestration and storage. And sequestration is the capture of CO2 from the atmosphere. And the maximum rate of sequestration occurs at the culmination of periodic annual increment. For you non-foresters out there, periodic annual increment is the growth as measured over a period of time divided by the length of the period. Usually, you know, it might be a 10-year period, just average increment. The maximum storage of carbon probably occurs at about the culmination of mean annual increment, when the rates of carbon uptake equal the losses of carbon. And mean annual increment is total volume, basal area, or size divided by the total age of the tree or stand. At culmination, mean annual increment equals periodic annual increment. Here's just a chart, and this is very general, and John insists that looking at these kinds of relationships that are not on a species and site-specific basis is a little bit spurious, if you will. But I just wanted to illustrate this relationship to you. And the blue line is PAI, and the red line is MAI. And sometimes when you reach culmination of MAI, they call it the biological rotation age. So one of the things you need to understand here is that these concepts apply to even-age stands. They were developed with Scots pine in Europe. So even-aged intolerant species And the age at CMAI can be estimated from yield tables and growth models, but you have to understand that those only go out a certain period of time, like maybe they go out 100 years. And CMAI may never be attained in redwood or in mixed conifer, in species in species mixes where there's tolerant and intolerant species, or in the case of redwood, there's no evidence that it ever reaches CMAI. So, but I want you to understand that when you're looking at PAI, what you're looking at is net CO2 uptake. That's a surrogate for net CO2 uptake. And then you're looking at MAI, you're looking at net storage of living in the living trees. So what does this tell you? This tells you that the actual rate of uptake of CO2 peaks out relatively early in the age of the sand. And the storage continues to increase until you reach a point where the growth and the increased storage starts to decline. Now, does it ever really decline? No, some of the evidence indicates that, with old growth stands, they still continue to accrue volume. I just want you to understand that these are kind of surrogates for the carbon picture. So there's some questions then that come out of this stuff. What is our objective in managing forests? Do we want to maximize sequestration rates? Do we want to take as much CO2 out of the atmosphere as possible, as quickly as possible? Do we want to maximize storage? Do we want, essentially to have as much carbon stored in those forests as possible? Do we want to do both? Do we have this issue where when you maximize storage, you also increase the risk of reversal through wildfire, insects, and disease? One of John's interesting points was that probably the best way to manage the mixed conifer forest to maximize carbon storage is to do nothing, because it's going to continue to have ingrowth of tolerant species. And then what happens, though? Then you have overstocked stands susceptible to insects, disease, and fire. So I just pose these questions because there's something to think about. It's not just one size fits all here in terms of the carbon picture. So let's look at carbon storage by ownership. First thing we want to know is how much area there is out there. And for those of you that aren't really familiar with some of this terminology, timberland, first off, reserved versus unreserved forests. Unreserved forests in FIA are considered to be forests that are available for harvest. Reserves are considered to be unavailable for harvest. Okay, so, and then when you look at timberland defined by FIA means it's capable of producing at least 20 cubic feet per acre per year. The state defines timberland as capable of producing 15 cubic feet per acre per year. Generally, if you're thinking about site classes, we're talking about site classes 1 through 4 being timberland. Other forests can be oak woodland, pinyon juniper, producing less than 19 cubic feet per acre per year. So it's relatively unproductive and not generally considered to be commercial forests. Looking at the forest area by ownership, you can see that there's 32 million acres of forest in California, and that 18.5 million of that is on federal. And by federal, I mean not just Forest Service, but also BLM, Department of Defense, etc. Other public is non-federal but public, like state and local agencies. Private, tribal, 12.6 million acres. There's the totals. So then you look at the volume by ownership, millions of cubic feet. And federal lands, again, National Forest, BLM, Department of Defense, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, 64 million, 64,000 millions of cubic feet. And it's basically almost twice what's on the private and tribal land. One thing about this is that the distribution of the sizes of trees on especially the national forest versus the private lands, there's more larger trees on the national forest than there are on the private lands. So I don't have the diameter distributions here, but in my report, in the FRAP report, we will have a diagram that shows the distribution of size classes by ownership. So look at carbon storage, and first let's look at what's in the above ground dead and living plant materials, and this is in millions of short tons. So on the federal lands, the grand total is 710 million tons of carbon, and on the private lands, 380 million tons of carbon. When you look at carbon storage, what you're really doing is you're using this rule of thumb, and you're taking the biomass that's estimated for these areas of the millions of cubic feet, and you're multiplying it times 0.5. That relationship is sort of like, I guess, just been adopted, but has never really been verified for California. And there actually is research going on now to try to verify what proportion of biomass is actually carbon for the different California species. Carbon below ground, millions of tons, is estimated on the basis of what's called the Carnes equation, which is a proportional relationship to the above ground biomass. Again, this is a very difficult thing to get at. And so some of these rules of thumb have been adopted to estimate these really unmeasurable quantities. So carbon below ground, just suffice it to say that it's just a proportion of what's above ground, and those numbers, are simply that. Now, looking at carbon storage by forest types, the two forest types that have the most carbon storage are the mixed conifer and the western oak. And why is that? Well, it's because the mixed conifer is 7.8 million acres in California, and the western oak is 9.5 million acres. Just looking at the difference in terms of the amount and the fact that the oak is more extensive than the mixed conifer, you can see the difference in productivity. These are average levels across all site classes and stocking levels. Okay, the next one, the types with the highest average levels of above ground living tree storage. These are average levels across all site classes and stocking levels. So at the top of the chart is redwood, 100 tons per acre, averaged across the entire range of redwood. That's measured by the FIA plots. 60 tons per acre for Doug fir, 59 tons per acre for the fir spruce mountain hemlock, upper elevation forest type. I didn't include mixed conifer here, but there's been an independent estimate by Bill Stewart that indicated about 55 tons per acre for mixed conifer. That was based on 1,100 plots that he evaluated. The FIA data has this kind of information for all of the major forest types in California. So when the reports are actually released and the tables are actually released to the public, you'll be able to actually pick out whatever forest type you want to look at. Let's look at harvest mortality and growth. First, let's look at the national forests. The green bar is growth. The orange bar is removals, essentially harvest. The reddish bar is mortality, and the blue bar is the net change. So if you take all forest land on national forests, there is about 10 what, let's see, say cubic feet per acre per year. There's an increment of about 10 cubic feet per acre per year on the national forests for all forest lands. But when you look across here and you see that there's a lot of growth going on in the timberland and there's very little removal, but there's quite a bit of mortality. So the growth on timberland is slightly more, 22, maybe 22 cubic feet per acre per year. But let's look at the wilderness area. Mortality outstrips growth. And so the net change in wilderness areas is negative. Nearly 20 cubic feet per acre per year is being lost in wilderness areas. And then the other forests, which, the oak woodlands, pinyon juniper, and so on, again, there's a minor net increase. So let's look at private lands. Now, there's other federal lands, too, included here. So that would be the Fish and Wildlife Service lands, the National Park Service. Again, very little removal. Mortality is much more limited, and the net growth is much higher. Okay, for state and local lands, which for the most part we're talking about like the state forest, like Jackson State Forest. We're talking also about local ownerships in conservation reserves that might never be harvested. Very limited harvest and a lot of increase in terms of the net increase in volume. Okay. Looking at corporate lands, this is the forest industry. There's a limited amount of, well, there's quite a bit of harvest, obviously, on the private lands where it's all coming from now. And there's, about 10 cubic feet per acre per year of increment in volume on the private land, the corporate land. Non-corporate, the non-industrial landowners are growing a lot of wood, and they're not harvesting a whole lot of it, and they're not experiencing a whole lot of mortality. So again, the net change is pretty dramatic. So what is this message telling you? It's telling you that harvest is not exceeding growth. Harvest and mortality are not exceeding growth on most land types, with the exception of wilderness. Well, if that's happening, well then probably the net increases in carbon are also positive. Makes sense, right? Let's look at carbon and site productivity. Excuse me. Let me tell you one thing here first, because I didn't change these units. So these units are in metric tons, and that's equal to 1.1 short tons. So this is total carbon storage by site class for mixed conifer, just as an example. And you can get it for any of the major forest types. Site class 1 being the most productive, site class 4 being the least. So the total carbon storage, numbers of acres, the average carbon storage tons per acre, and the average CO2 equivalents. And you can see there's a relationship. Site 1 lands store more carbon and more CO2 than Site 4 lands. Okay, so there is a relationship, and you can see that relationship for all the forest types. Now, for the top 5 forest types, when they're fully stocked, and when I mean fully stocked, it means they're stocked to the extent that they're, they're maximizing the productivity of the site. The top 5 are redwood, fir spruce, mountain hemlock, Doug fir, California mixed conifer, and then tan oak laurel. So those are the ones that have the most carbon per acre when they're fully stocked. So let's look at some opportunities here. My notes pertain to slide numbers, but the slide numbers aren't showing up on my screen. So bear with me here, okay? All right, so one of the things we're doing in the prep assessment, we're trying to look at some opportunities. And one opportunity is to increase the stocking in understock stands if you want to increase carbon storage. And so what this shows you is on the national forest versus the private lands, the top, well, really the commercial forest types in California. These are the commercial forest types. And by site class, the numbers of acres that are understocked. What this information tells you, at least tells me, may not tell you, is that if you want to increase stocking and increase carbon storage, you would focus on Site 2 mixed conifer on national forest and Site 1 and Site 2 redwood lands on private land. Okay, so those are in the case of the redwood, you're talking about, well, let's see, 140,000 acres of potential land where you can increase stocking and also increase carbon storage. Now, I have a particular bent towards redwood in terms of carbon because redwood is on the coast where you've got a really nice climate, you've got good sites, you've got relatively limited disturbance regimes in the sense that you don't have the stand replacing fires that you have on the coast as frequently, I mean, in the Sierra as frequently. So I think, you know, for my money, I would focus my efforts on increasing storage on these higher site lands in the redwood country. Here's another one. Restore forest cover on lands affected by wildfire, insects, and disease. There's at least 156,000 acres of private land that is what the Forest Service calls deforested. And I don't want to, you know, raise any images of the Amazon here, but the truth is that deforested is what they are. They've been, you know, the mortality is severe, and they basically need to be regenerated. And now this 156,000 acres, that's based on the FIA data. That doesn't include the recent fires, the King Fire, the Rim Fire. So, you know, there's a bunch more land out there now. Just on the King Fire where I've been working, you know, there's, you know, at least 20,000, I'm not sure how many acres of land that needs to be reforested. The National Forest Inventory that's maintained by Joe Sherlock, there's about 4 million acres on national forests that are in a state of needing to be regenerated, and about 400,000 acres of those require planting. If you restore forest cover, just harken back to that chart of PAI versus MAI. If you're restoring forest cover, you're creating new stands, and hopefully you're managing them to enhance their growth, and you're getting increased rates of CO2 sequestration on those lands. Now, how does this all get done? Well, one of the ways is through the AB 32 grant program. It's a little more difficult on the federal lands, but you know, that's one option. Other opportunities, reduce stocking in stands that are excessively stocked and at risk of wildfire, insects, and disease. So we've got, you know, a total of over 500,000 acres that we can identify through FIA that are overstocked and at risk. And so maintaining carbon stocks in part means reducing the risk of loss. So the measure of stocking is called the stand density index, and the forest health specialists use that as a risk factor for insect attacks. So stand density index is the way that I understand it is an indicator of optimal stocking. And when it's above certain levels for the forest types, then you consider them to be overstocked and at risk. So just in summary, there's over 32 million acres of forest land in California that currently store almost 1.4 million tons above and below ground carbon. On all the ownerships except National Forest Wilderness, growth exceeds harvest and mortality, implying that carbon storage is increasing on most lands. Now, there's been some research that's recently been published by Gonzalez and others that in part contradicts these findings and attributes actually net reductions in carbon storage to wildfire emissions. And you might want to take a look at that article. You can see the citation there. And it'll be interesting to get some feedback on that article if you'd like to send me any notes that you feel about that, because there's some issues about it that people have raised, and it's interesting to hear what your opinions are. Mixed conifer and oak have the most carbon storage, while redwood, Doug fir, and spruce fir, mountain hemlock store the most carbon per acre. Carbon sequestration and storage vary by site, and the redwood's a clear winner. I mean, it stores the most carbon per acre, and it also, will grow ad infinitum. So the opportunities exist to increase carbon storage in understocked or unstocked stands and to reduce the risk in overstocked stands. And I think you got to do both. So what about carbon storage and wood products? I'm just going to leave this as a tickler. This is a chart that just shows you the amount of wood that is in wood products between 1952 and 2012. And the blue line indicates the storage from timber derived from primarily federal lands and primarily national forests. And the green shows you the storage derived from private lands. So where does this all fit in? Where does harvesting fit into a carbon management scheme? We'll be talking about that as we go down the line here. All right, so if anybody's got any questions, I'm here. I guess Glenn's been talking about, oh, Glenn, you're here. I hope you didn't get offended by my coverage of FIA. Glenn Christensen is the FIA guru. Okay, so we have any questions here?